So today I was interested in asking you what was your personal introduction to the work of the film director Allan Dwan.
It was Silver Load, you know, because that's sort of an iconic Western.
Yeah, but at that time you weren't really aware of Allan Dwan.
Yeah, I mean, I think I found out about him, I guess, through I check movies through all the lists, and I think just watching highly rated westerns or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the ones that I just came across, and for like 2 years after that, I didn't have any like further knowledge about who he was. Just thought of him as like some non-autorial, minor, you know, old Hollywood director who I'd seen the major work of, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess it was fair to say either Silver Load or maybe the World War II picture of John Wayne, Sands of Iwo Jima.
Oh, I didn't see that until much later. Yeah.
I was going to say those two are probably his two most well-known films.
Yeah, those are the most... Well, I mean, depending on what sort of context you're talking about,
yeah.
I think there are quite a few others that are sort of renowned in certain spheres of interest, but I think in terms of more general film interest, those are maybe the only two that cut through to maybe general audiences today.
Because the thing of Allan Dwan is, I recall this one day in 2019 when you came to visit my unit at the time, and you were seemingly raving about your newfound interest in Allan Dwan, and I believe, correct me if I'm mistaken, that this was motivated by your viewing and your very enthusiastic reception toward 1916 Western titled The Good Bad Man.
Yeah, I think it might have been. I want to quickly check the order that I saw his films in records on I Check Movies, but yeah, I think I was watching a lot of Westerns at the time, I think, and you know, I've just been trying to watch interesting Westerns from various eras.
Yeah.
So I have the record up here. The first one I saw was Silver Load, then Tennessee's Partner, which is sort of another like celebrated late Western, and then Sands of Iwo Jima, and then The Good Bad Man, which was in that period where I was watching a lot of Westerns, and that was like quite a while later, I believe.
Yeah.
I think my interest had sort of stemmed from... He was sort of a peer of D.W. Griffith. He was sort of a collaborator, protege and peer of D.W. Griffith. And, you know, I guess after somewhat neglecting silent films in prior years and prior times of my interest in film, I had, you know, come around with more interest, and D.W. Griffith is obviously a key figure of that era, and you know, is sort of seen as a very seminal and important figure in the history of silent films, as well as someone who a lot of major filmmakers, you know, somewhat emerged out of. You know, Dwan being one, but also people like Raoul Walsh and Victor Fleming and, you know, many other...
John Ford, right?
John Ford, many other, you know, noteworthy filmmakers in US history.
King Vidor as well, right?
I'm not sure about that, to be honest.
Okay.
I would be surprised if they didn't have any association.
Okay. I just remember, I once read an anecdote where King Vidor was, I don't remember what film it was, maybe Duel in the Sun, I could be mistaken. He was shooting and Griffith came to visit the set, and Vidor felt so self-conscious that he demanded Griffith stand behind one of the props so that Griffith wouldn't see him directing and couldn't judge him.
I'm sure that's true. I mean, I think there was briefly a period where not only was he sort of artistically the most influential filmmaker in the world, he was also very powerful in the Hollywood studio system as the, one of the founders of United Artists, and someone who had a lot of sway over many major up-and-comers in the industry.
Well, speaking of Allan Dwan's association with D.W. Griffith, there is a claim out there. I don't know if it's been proven. Some people seemingly consider this to be conjecture. But there's a claim that Allan Dwan invented there's that famous tracking shot in Intolerance, Love Struggle Throughout the Ages. And it's been stated that Griffith employed Dwan to create the equipment for this shot and to kind of help him map it out.
Yeah.
I've read this claim in at least 2 places on the internet, but again, there's nothing I can't verify this for sure.
Yeah, I think I've heard about this as well. I'm not surprised because, famously those 2 massive productions, Birth of a Nation and Intolerance, they had a lot of assistant directors, a lot of people, a lot of major film talents working under Griffith on that. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that some of these major innovations would be collaborative. Because, of course, in the legacy of Griffith, as much as he is a major filmmaker, many of sort of the direct innovations that he was credited with, or perhaps is still credited with, were sort of existed previously in a rough form in the work of like a pioneer like Edwin S. Porter. And Griffith was really, his biggest accomplishment, at least as I see it, is really being able to synthesize these things effectively into a really holistic vision of a feature film,
yes,
which really didn't exist quite in the same way beforehand. And I think he really set film ahead through that. And not to take credit away from how important the work with Billy Bitzer was in, setting the ball rolling on cinematic compositions, and there really is a lot to credit him with. But I think it is definitely plausible. It's something that I would find believable that he would have subcontracted Dwan to innovate there.
Well, one claim you may find surprising about Allan Dwan, I certainly did, is, again, one may have to seek verification for this, although I read somewhere on the internet that the inspiration for some of the parties in F. Scott Fitzgerald's literature, particularly obviously The Great Gatsby, were inspired by parties that Allan Dwan would throw during the 1920s when he was a very successful Hollywood director.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. I can only imagine. Dwan had been in Hollywood California, I should say, since at least 1911. That's when I believe he founded it was one of the very first motion picture studios in California, and he'd been there for a very long time. And I was curious because you've watched a lot of westerns, and obviously you're familiar with Edwin S. Porter's work in The Great Train Robbery.
Yeah.
And you're very fond of the work of John Ford, including the pioneering 1926 feature The Iron Horse.
Yeah.
Do you consider The Good Bad Man or Allan Dwan's work in the 20s as kind of a midway point between these two things?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Good Bad Man and The Half-Breed, although The Half-Breed has some unfortunate, depictions.
Sure, yeah.
Native Americans. You have to look at those kind of films in the course of history, because if you think about something like The Great Train Robbery, which you cited, and other early westerns, those are sort of an era where the West is really a fresh memory, and it's not as much driven by that sort of fascination with it is very is more grounded in the reality, and it's not as much shaped by, there were still these pulp novelists like Zane Grey and Carl May and whoever you want to think about. But I think you look at a film like The Great Train Robbery, it's not as much of an aestheticization of the West in of itself as something like The Good Bad Man. And I think that's really where that exists on that trajectory. And I think you can also point to some of Griffith's shorts in like the early 1910s, and probably some of the other shorts made by, a variety of US directors in the preceding decade, the 1900s. But yeah, like I don't think you really necessarily have, you have to have that link in the chain somewhere between that and then, a vision like The Iron Horse of like a fully fledged Western mythos.
That's a fantastic thought. A few more things I was interested in inquiring about Dwan is, well, I find it interesting in that we've both developed a bit of a fascination with this director. For me, I'm just, I love that. Well, he's one of these remarkable figures who he was a silent era pioneer, and he continued working into the sound era. But unlike some of his contemporaries, like we mentioned John Ford, we might also mention Michael Curtiz, these directors remained fairly consistently popularly successful throughout the decades and received, especially in John Ford's case, much acclaim, whereas Allan Dwan seemed to go a bit by the wayside.
Well, I might have to disagree with that a little bit. So I think, not to cut into it too early, but I think, although I may as well, I think the comparison between Curtiz and Dwan is a really interesting one.
Okay.
And I remember how this first came up. You said to me, which one do you prefer? Which filmmaker do you like more?
Okay.
And the answer that I gave at the time, I remember this so clearly, I said, they're different.
Mm-hmm.
And then I thought about it a bit more. They're not different. They're very similar in really a lot of ways. And of course, the reason why I said they're different is so that I didn't have to give an answer that was shitting on a director that I liked.
Yes.
But yeah, they are very similar. Like, they started working in the film industry around the same time. They finished working in the film industry around the same time.
Yes.
They're sort of known for similar varieties of, I guess you call them genre films. They're sort of known for genre films, both of them. They were both at the heights of Hollywood in different periods of time.
Yeah.
I think it's a very instructive comparison. But Curtiz wasn't at the height of Hollywood for his whole career.
Yeah.
Right? Like, unlike Dwan, he started in Europe and was sort of gained recognition there in Hungary and moved west and through Europe and eventually to the United States, where he, started off directing smaller pictures and really gained breakthrough recognition for Noah's Ark.
Yes.
And at the time that he made that, Dwan was, in a sense, already in decline in terms of his fame. His peak period of fame is like that mid-1920s period where he was really one of the kings of Hollywood, one of the major film directors. He was making, commercially successful, acclaimed films with Barrymore, and it was big bucks, and he'd, superseded his friend and mentor, Griffith, as, in terms of his success. And I feel like at a brief moment there around somewhere in the early 30s, their paths sort of briefly met and then diverged, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, Dwan was on the way down and Curtiz was on the way up. And that didn't last forever for Curtiz.
No.
He was very successful and influential through the 30s. Obviously, Casablanca in the 40s, and this period of just like hit after hit after hit after hit. But the thing that happened with Michael Curtiz is at the end of his career, I think he left. I can't remember what studio he was at the time, but he ended up leaving due to it shutting down or him being fired or something like that. And he started his own production company briefly. And it didn't go so well, which is why, like, post maybe 1954, there aren't really the same kind of big Curtiz films. Like, you have the last really like major film that you'll hear people talk about is White Christmas. Beyond that, I mean, I've seen it, a few of them. They're not the worst, but
I at least enjoy his 1961 film of Francis of Assisi.
yeah,
I recall.
I guess my favorite of that last few years of like maybe 1956 to the end might be his last film, The Comancheros, which I think he basically ghost directed that for John Wayne, which, the best film that John Wayne directed, frankly.
Yeah. Nice.
And interestingly, The Comancheros, it sort of has some of the elements that I like about The Good and Bad Man, to make an odd comparison.
Yeah.
I think there's sort of a stark clarity of image and of sort of message to The Good Bad Man.
Yeah,
it's really that's really something that is so interesting of that. That's something of the pre-New Wave era that's sort of lost today. You can't really have that because of changes in how people consume and interact with narratives. Yeah. So you can't have those kind of like stark linear morality play type things. Yeah. And I think The Comancheros sort of is on the dying end of that in a funny way.
Yeah.
It's 1962. It's the dawn of New Hollywood. And it's also the final film of Michael Curtiz before his death. It's sort of in a way, it's sort of a poetic final film to be situated.
It is very interesting. There's a quote attributed to the famous film critic Andrew Sarris, where he claimed that Casablanca was unique among the great films and that it was not directed by an auteur. I'm not necessarily getting into the question of whether Curtiz and or Dwan were auteurs. You can get into that if you like. But I do find it interesting that people like Dwan, and especially Curtiz, who has directed quite a number of to this day, consistently critically acclaimed films, not just Casablanca. We're talking about Robin Hood, or
Breaking Point,
Mildred Pierce, Passage to My Side. There you go, Dr. X.
The aforementioned White Christmas. Curtiz has a lot of acclaimed films, a really large number of significant films.
Yeah, and it seems as though people like Curtiz and Dwan have been not included in some of the canons of great directors as consistently because of this idea that Curtiz and Dwan were not auteurs. Do we feel as though this emphasis, that there's been too much of an emphasis on the auteur in terms of which directors are worth discussing and which aren't just worth discussing? Because the question of whether John Ford is an auteur or not is I think an interesting one in and of itself, because he was a very technical filmmaker, but his films are so disparate in what they are like from film to film, and I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think, you know, this is something that I feel like it's an unresolved tension in the film community that really has its roots back in, as you said, people like Andrew Sarris, the origin of auteur theory, that revolution in film criticism that happened in the 50s and 60s. And really, to be honest, it has its roots back at the formative misconceptions of cinema. Like, I would love to write an essay about the formative misconceptions of cinema. And what I'm referring to specifically here is to the way that film was seen in comparison to precursors to film, namely theatre and literature. And so, I mean, you see that in the name of the auteur theory. It's referencing the author, right? Like, it's referencing the author of the book. And as, you know, every 13-year-old who first reads the Wikipedia page for auteur theory will say, well, but not one person made a film. One person writes a book, but multiple people make a film. So, you know, that difference is very, you know, obvious and well understood. But the way that auteur theory was initially framed, while more complex than the you know, reference I was just making, was around this idea of the analog with the book, where there was a look towards thematic content and literal parallels between films and the authorial fingerprint to verify whether a director was an auteur or, you know, I suppose just a nobody, right?
Yeah.
Like I suppose Andrew Sarris probably looked at Curtiz in that way, but the thing about that is, and this comes down to the other line, which is along the tangent of theatre, which is that film, because it had its roots very much in theatre early on, you know, you can look at formative filmmakers from every country, whether it be Griffith and his precursors, or you know, people like Kinugasa in Japan and Fei Mu in mainland China and so on. These people all came from theatre, so they had a very literary, and this continued for ages. Like, you can also point to someone like Orson Welles,
yeah.
Right? Not really a formative figure, but, you know, certainly represented the commanding heights of film for a long period of time. So from this view of theatre as the foundation of film, this led to, I think, a lot of the overemphasis on narrative, the thematic content of a film, because of course the text of a play is the screenplay.
Yeah.
Is not the screenplay, the written play, right?
Yeah.
Like the writing. It's a literary medium in most iterations of theatre, and I think that really translated into the world of film. Whereas I think with a more sophisticated understanding today, we can see that, you know, the authorship of a film is really in its visual structure. Like, it's really about, you know, the way that you know, it's shot, the way it's edited, the way it's put together visually. That is the relevant qualities of the medium. is the visual, and to a lesser extent the auditory, the sonic. So because of that, I think historically people would look at someone like Michael Curtiz or Allan Dwan as well, and they would see them and say, well, there's not a lot of, thematic content that is similar between these. There's not a lot of reused visual metaphors that we could really point to, or there's not a lot of their films aren't structured after a pattern. There's no really obvious top level parallels that run throughout all their films. So this guy's obviously just a studio hack who didn't, is not the true author of their films. But really, I think that's a fingerprint. Like, what is a fingerprint? It's just repetition. Is that what it takes to be an author? To me, it seems like a very limiting view, and I've been in arguments with people about this previously, and I just think that the real artistry of someone like Curtiz or Dwan, and really many other directors, a lot of other talented directors from that, first half of cinema, the pre-New Wave half of cinema, chronological half, I suppose, rather than by volume.
Oh,
A lot of their skill was in the technical precision of their work, was in the ability to realize a screenplay or ideas in aesthetic terms. And it's been pointed out before about Curtiz that, there are some things that some semblances of a trademark. Like, famously, he would use shadows prominently in a lot of his films, and I think had perhaps some bearing on the development of film noir through that vein. So while you might view Curtiz and Dwan as not auteurs, and that's probably a valid position, even after our perspectives realign on film and where narrative should be situated in film, and what qualities we should look for in forward-thinking film. Like, even when there's a realignment, which I think will come in that department, it'd still be valid perhaps to say that Curtiz isn't an auteur, perhaps, depending on how you want to evoke that term.
Yeah.
But then then so what? I'm someone who, follows a lot of cinematographers.
Yeah.
They're not auteurs.
Mm-hmm.
I like a good cinematographer. They so important in, particularly the celluloid era, but even today, in what can be done with the image. And, there are so many great artists who, worked as cameramen. If they're not auteurs, so what? We should still appreciate and celebrate their talents. And, I think a lot of auteurs are just, not very good filmmakers. So, in comparison to Michael Curtiz, if we're gonna, weigh them up, I think auteurhood is worth far less than talent and skill and the qualitative value of the practice of your art.
It's a great series of statements. I was going to ask, was out of curiosity, where your because obviously we all saw Casablanca at a fairly early stage in our film development, but I was curious as to where your more considered appreciation of Michael Curtiz what films really were the catalyst for this?
For my interest in Michael Curtiz. Really, I think in this case, it was not so much that I'd seen anything in particular that had interested me in his work. Unlike Dwan, it was really just seeing the films.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some commonalities that I think maybe that interested me that we might talk about later. But for Curtiz, it was really, he had this, and still has this, reputation as, you know, this incredibly accomplished non-auteur.
Yeah.
And something appealed to me about watching all of those films, you know, like it's you know, when I embarked and started watching a lot of them, my reasoning was that I thought, you know, this will allow me to see behind the curtain of, I don't know, the mysteries of the medium itself.
Yeah,
right?
Okay.
Because in the sort of the patterns and the entire in the entirety of this enormous body of work of this guy who sits at this like odd contradiction of the greatest director who is not an auteur, you know, as some might say, you know, I'd hope to see those great truths. And I suppose, you know, it's not like I'd never appreciated his work. Like I'd seen Casablanca, I think, when I was 12 or somewhere in that range, I think. You know, it was not long after I'd seen Citizen Kane and a few other, you know, noted film titles. And it of course, it very much impressed me.
Oh, yeah.
And I, of course, seen a number of his other, you know, well-regarded films like Robin Hood in childhood and Mildred Pierce when I was checking out the classics and so on.
It's interesting how both Dwan and Curtiz directed seminal and still fairly acclaimed Robin Hood pictures.
Yeah, I think it's a great point of comparison for them, because it also speaks to another similarity between Curtiz and Dwan, which is that they're known for those, I think we mentioned before, they're known for those genre pictures. But really, specifically, I think Dwan comes from that tradition of like the epic, melodramatic, low-action genre film, whereas Curtiz was really what replaced that with these like fast-paced adventure kind of films. And in a sense, it really speaks to Dwan as this guy who comes from, you know, who has a very theatrical perspective on film, whereas Curtiz has a very filmic perspective on film.
It's very interesting because I'm thinking right now of the way that in the silent era, neither Dwan nor Curtiz directed this film, but at some point this year I revisited the 1926 silent pirate epic, The Black Pirate, starring Douglas Fairbanks, and I was thinking about the way that film is shot, almost as though it's like they're literally just filming the set and the actors are little figurines on the set, whereas a Curtiz film, say in Captain Blood in 1935, they'd follow him around, you know, and we were following the adventure from the perspective of, we were kind of in this, on the ship there with Errol Flynn, rather than, you know, The Black Pirate is filmed as though we're in the audience watching a play, in a sense. I guess he just wanted to have these expansive sets all in one.
Yeah.
But you know, it's interesting to think about.
Because I think there was I think if you look over the course of film history, there's been a gradual like unfastening of the rigidity of the camera, right? And I think you can also see that somewhat in early Curtiz, right?
Yeah.
Like if you watch The Undesirable or Sodom and Young Medardus is an even better example where, you know, it was something of an epic film with big scenes, but they would be shot from like a perpendicular perspective onto events, and I mean, I still think that there is a really cohesive cinematographic philosophy there. Like
Absolutely.
there is a lot of, you know, attention and effort going into the compositions, and I think it's really, you know, I think you really can appreciate it even with all that's transpired in cinema since. But it's definitely true as you progress in the Curtiz filmography, he definitely moves towards that, you know, classical Hollywood sort of graceful fluidity, if you will. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You can kind of situate a camera in the midst of a conversation between characters on a set, and you no longer have to frame it as though everything is in illustrative landscape painting. You know, you can have you know, you can just have the top half of the three men in frame having a conversation. You know, this was, you know, probably considered a bit unglamorous in the silent era. I don't know. The third film director I wanted to discuss today is none other than King Vidor. What do you believe your introduction to the work of King Vidor was?
My introduction, I think it was The Crowd. I think it's generally considered his most famous film. I think I saw it just like among the bevy of legendary silents out there. And I think I also saw like some of the other most famous silents before I would see any of his later work. Like I think I also saw The Big Parade and Show People. That might have been my first 3 films from King Vidor.
I have noted that, and I believe we discussed this very briefly whilst we weren't recording, and this that King Vidor seems to have a very powerful reputation amongst old Hollywood film directors, and to this day he seems to be a rather lauded, beloved figure in comparison to the relative obscurity of Allan Dwan and the kind of I don't know what we'd call it, the
dismissive attitude towards Curtiz.
Yeah, dismissive might be a strong word, but there is a little bit of a, well, there's something. People seem to have a very vocal appreciation for King Vidor's skill as a very technical filmmaker, and as someone who pioneered the utilization of mass groups of people in the context of a film narrative, and works like The Big Parade and The Crowd are considered very pioneering in this respect.
If I had to put it down to one thing, I mean, I think the first thing to say, even though they are similar in a lot of ways, all 3, there are very noteworthy differences in the way their approach to the screen, and they, in a sense, they all represent a very different aspect to the, you know, classical Hollywood era. They, you know, and I think if, you know, we talked a little bit before about how Dwan comes from that Griffithian, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, okay.
Theatrical staging and linear clarity. Curtiz comes from not expressionism, but an Eastern European aestheticism. That, you know, his peers from back in his Hungary days, the Corder brothers, also brought to Hollywood.
That's a good point. I forgot that the Quarters were like, we have Quarters 1919 work, Man of Gold, which is very expressionistic.
Yeah, apparently from what I've read, they actually knew each other. They were rivals back in Hungary.
Interesting.
Prior to yeah. So they were very so there's that. And then you have King Vidor, and I'm trying to find the right term here, but I think he's very much he's a very intellectual filmmaker. He represents sort of the like the summit of old Hollywood as like high art, I guess you would say. I mean, there are some other people we might be able to put in that category as well, but that's I think what you might think of when you think of King Vidor. Like he was known for his very painterly framing and cinematography. He was known for his like really direct use of ethical and conceptual themes and metaphors in his films. Like, I mean, The Crowd is possibly one of the best examples of that, as well as his most well-known film. Just that metaphor of the crowd, the effectiveness of how that's integrated. So I think, in a sense, the reason why King Vidor is more acclaimed or celebrated today than the others is that he carries a different aura by virtue of the kind of films that he made. Like, I think it's really a matter of perception rather than necessarily reality. Like, the idea that you have a filmmaker who he's just a good example of someone who you can easily look at and say there are continuities in his filmmaking. There's he's a pioneer of this, he's a pioneer of that, and his films are very not austere, but like they feel very serious and grand. So I think, compared to someone like Dwan, who, for the last 20 years at least of his directorial career was not making high art cinema, I think a lot of people might gravitate more to King Vidor.
Definitely. I was interested in discussing what some of your, because from what I remember, and I believe this is just my recollection of taking cursory glances at how many King Vidor films were in your memory mash list.
Yeah.
I know my recollection is that there's representations from all throughout his career. I've noted that obviously you're a fan of the silent era of King Vidor. I know that you've expressed a lot of praise toward 1946's Duel in the Sun, and to some extent of 1949's The Fountainhead. And also I noted, I believe it was King Vidor, you informed me that King Vidor's last film work was a short documentary subject on a painter whom a famous American painter whose name I don't recall. It's not Edward Hopper, but it's and this individual artist was a big influence on King Vidor's own work.
No, the other way around.
Oh,
King
is that
Vidor
right?
was a huge influence on the painter.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I think they said, I think they were saying that, I can't remember if it was Show People or The Big Parade. I think it might have been The Big Parade. They were saying that film, they'd seen it 100 times, and that the personal inspiration behind many of their paintings was the work of King Vidor, and particularly that film.
That's fantastic. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, apparently he held the on the basis of that short, he held the record in Guinness Book of World Records for longest working film director.
Wow.
At a certain time. I mean, obviously, he's not as long working as like Manuel de Oliveira.
I was thinking that.
Yeah, but still, I mean, it is a long time, like
It is a long time.
70 years as a working director.
Yeah. When this short came out in the 70s.
1980.
80. Okay.
Yeah, pretty late. Yeah, I was just looking. It's not necessarily every era of his
Okay.
career represented at present, there's a big gap. In most of the 30s, I don't have anything in, but
Interesting, yeah.
I think there's more I need to explore there anyway.
Mm-hmm. The only film I can think of that he directed in the 1930s that I've seen is Bird of Paradise, and that's a whole bag of worms to get into.
I mean, the one that I have in here is Street Scene, but
Uh-huh.
I've seen a few others. Like, he did a Billy the Kid Western in like 1930, which was one of his worst films.
Mm-hmm. I remember you often celebrate Duel in the Sun as one of the. It's fair to say you'd consider that one of the better westerns of the 1940s. You probably consider it one of the better American westerns in general.
Yeah, maybe the best.
Wow.
I don't know. I'd have to think before calling it the best
Yeah.
Western ever. But in terms of the best Western from the 1940s, possibly, like quite, I could see myself saying that.
Do you think Duel in the Sun is more of the kind of good bad man approach of the message film, or is it hinting at the later
I feel like there's
greyness of the West genre?
I mean, really, if you look at that film, you have to say it's like an evolutionary dead end, right? Like it's a path of development that really never eventuated into, more. There weren't really films that followed that, and there aren't really as much. What I'm saying is it's going off on its own tangent, really, and I think it's yeah, there is sort of a thematic starkness to it that is, of that, classical Western strand, but it's also, I mean, there's so much turbulence in that film that I think it sort of pollutes that, you know what I mean? I don't feel like anyone watches that film and really feels like it's in the same cut as a lot of these morality play John Ford Westerns, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a Stagecoach or something like that. Even though, maybe arguably that was the intent. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
That's interesting.
I mean, I think beyond just that, like, I feel like I'm obliged somewhat to make a bit of a case for that film, because I think, if as you know, as anyone who knows that film knows, there's a bit of a, it has a bit of a divisive reputation as a film that was overly melodramatic, overlong. It's not necessarily considered a classic Western by a lot of people. But I think, there's so many things going on in that film, and there's such a perfection and I mean, it sounds weird to say perfection, but it's such a skillful and decided use of film language there to really tell this, in a sense, ridiculous story. It's just one of these films that sits on the intersection of those two things, right? Like the intersection of like that incredible use of film language, the Ray Renahan cinematography, absolutely at the peak. Like the cinematography in this film is incredible. I wouldn't have a problem arguing that it's, one of the 10 best shot westerns ever. It's at that, like that brief, the small point where the Venn diagram of that, all these things meet of like the bizarre melodramatic story, I guess you'd say Vidorian conceptual backgrounding to the whole thing. Masterful and deliberate use of film language in a really, in my opinion, a very forward-looking way. Like, where that Venn diagram meets, that's just on that one film. And that's what makes it such an incredible viewing experience. And I think there's also just like the fact that, you know, when it comes to the aspects that people criticize, you know, like we're talking about that time and those like classical stars. Like no one, that sort of, no, that can't be replicated, if you know what I mean. Like there's this, the things that people often criticize about it are these long, overly melodramatic passages and in particular the ending. But like you had people with incredible charisma just like doing this absolute insanity. Like that's something that it doesn't exist in the same way in, you know, in contemporary film, in film post the new wave. Like that's something that is somehow lost at time. And I think that's where I do agree with people that like old Hollywood stars, they were better.
Was King Vidor's last feature film Solomon and Sheba?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, this is 1960?
1959, I think.
59, yeah. Yeah, well, King Vidor seems that his 1950s films don't seem to have the same reputation of the earlier films. He did an adaptation of War and Peace, but of course the version, the Soviet film, is far more well known, even these days when King Vidor's film ever
yeah, I think
today anyway.
It does have its defenders.
Okay.
People do defend that film, and I think I can see why some people like it, but I think, look, it's a question of I suppose what character you want from the film, because obviously it's a really aggressive abridging of the original novel. And it's a sweetening and dressing up of the film into a, it's a Hollywood film. It really is a Hollywood film more than anything else, that particular film. So I think you can really see it situated in the Vidor filmography. That's the lens through which you're looking at an adaptation of War and Peace. I think there are defenders of it who would say it's better than the Bondarchuk film. I probably need to revisit the Vidor version to really, if I was really going to argue that. I wouldn't say that for now, at least.
Didn't King Vidor, he also directed, I think we were discussing this at some stage, he directed the first American feature film with an all-black cast?
Yeah, Hallelujah.
Okay, this is in the 19...
It's a musical. It's like 1932, 33, somewhere in there.
Okay, right.
Yeah, I mean, look, when it comes to a film like that, necessarily it's not gonna look good by today's standards, right?
It's a bit insensitive and... dated.
And features stereotypes,
right?
Of course. But I think, to some degree, you just have to appreciate that, if someone had to make that first film, we need to give credit to, King Vidor for doing that at a time when, the vast majority of films made in the US didn't have a black person. If they did, they were portrayed a lot worse than people in Hallelujah. So...
Isn't one of Michael Curtiz's early sound films one of these terrible blackface films? Mammy?
Oh, Mammy. Yes.
Yeah. There's unfortunate commonality between some of these people. I mean, I don't. King Vidor wasn't using blackface in his film.
No,
Whereas
this wasn't.
The Michael Curtiz film. I haven't seen Mammy, but I assume that's blackface. Just by
Yeah,
the
I
poster.
think so. Yeah.
Okay, that's a pretty terrible, egregious.
There is another reason why I was interested in these three directors, and I think it's a commonality that I don't know if you've thought about, but it takes me back to when I was there was a certain point when I sort of threw off the preconceptions that I came into film with, and I guess adopted a new set of conceptions. That was to look at film through, the language analogy, and to think about how it's constructed, and to think about film through the building blocks of it as an art form, rather than as, to deconstruct it essentially, rather than as viewing it innately as like a transposition of, a story or a novel onto the screen, where you'd be mad about, some minor actor with pop, who gives a half-assed performance. Like that kind of conventional conception. When I sort of threw off those chains, one of the things I wanted to do somewhat was to go back to the silent era and see the origins of film language, to see what film was like prior to, see those developmental stages, see what it was like before the modern film grammar that, sort of everything innately has these days that can't really be truly escaped.
Yeah.
And, after doing that a bit, one of the things I became interested in was the idea of a film director who had began their career in an era when film grammar was incomplete. Incomplete is perhaps the wrong word, but you get my meaning. And had ended their career, at the dawn of the new wave, or something like that. Who had gone from between those two periods, and with the perception that there might be something compelling in their last works, as someone who had really been there to observe the growth of film language, who had a long career. What would they try to do in their later works? And there were a number of, necessarily this was going to be someone in Hollywood. I mean, there are perhaps some analogues in France and elsewhere, but the best examples of this were going to be in Hollywood. And that's really a thing that unites those three directors, and that's why I had an interest into looking into them. I mean, there are some other people in this category that I ultimately found less satisfying, which I might mention in a sec, but these, King Vidor started in the early 1910s making newsreel films, shorts and stuff, gradually moved into Hollywood, etc., alongside the dawn of the feature film, and then, essentially ended his career in 1959, though he made 2 documentary shorts subsequently. And then you have like Michael Curtiz, who was making features in the early 1910s. Unfortunately now lost, but you know, pioneering feature filmmaker who really rode the wave of the expansion of film grammar and film productions as someone who really worked on the technical side of filmmaking.
Yeah.
And then you have Allan Dwan, you know, a peer and mentee of Griffith, who, you know, experienced that whole, you know, was a first-hand participant in the peak of Griffith's career, and then went on to be a, you know, long-lasting old-school filmmaker in Hollywood until 1961.
I find it interesting because I hadn't seen any of Michael Curtiz's silent films until a couple of years ago, and yeah, I was so impressed by them. They're well worthy of all of the acclaimed German silent films. Films like Young Medardus, Samson, Sodom and Gomorrah, The Undesirable,
Moon of Israel.
I don't think I've seen that one.
Oh, okay.
But that was a Hungarian one, right? Or German?
I think it was German.
Yeah.
Labyrinth of Horror.
That's a terrific one as well. And obviously those later the Hollywood films. But in particular, I wanted to bring up the films he made in Europe, because it's very easy to imagine films of that nature being re-released by, I don't know if this is easy to imagine, but let's say they were re-released and remastered by the Criterion Collection. I imagine Criterion audiences, fans of the restorations of Fritz Lang, for instance, and the Daniel Lung and Spiders work, would absolutely eat up these Michael Curtiz films, and and his reputation would no doubt soar upon people seeing, you know, pure unadulterated Curtiz is almost as artful as anyone in Europe at that time as far as film directors go, and I think it makes me consider whether perhaps Curtiz is someone whom quite willingly, or maybe not willingly, but he definitely did secede to the more fastened nature of the studio system. Like as soon as the 1920s hit, you see a lot. There's less technical. I mean, I don't know if I want to say there's less technical experimentation, but there's less. I guess expressionism was going out of vogue anyway.
I think he was moving away from these. You know, I think what you're talking about is the early films. Really, for their time, were epics.
Yeah.
Like major productions. You know, impressive cinematography. Everything was supposed to be major in scale.
Yeah.
And innovative. But beyond the silent era, really, you would see less and less of this in Curtiz. Really, the last one that I can think of off the top right now, of a film that was like truly epic in the sense of his early work, was Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
Right?
You even consider a Hollywood film in the 1930s. I mean, mind you, this is the 1930s, the era of the Depression, but take 1936 as The Charge of the Light Brigade. It's not that epic in scope. It's clearly all shot in California. The actual titular charge is absolutely grand, and you know it's one of the great spectacles of the 30s. As absolutely, I mean, you couldn't have done that without being exceptionally cruel to horses. Of course, so that's why you never get a scene like that again.
Yeah.
With that level of spectacle, even in the Tony Richardson film in the late 60s. But yeah, again, that film, it's there is a rigidity to it which, I mean, you compare that film to the Soviet Union's Alexander Nevsky, and it's like that's scope, right?
Yeah,
like, I'm not trying. I'm a fan of that Charge of the Light Brigade film, just to be clear. But there is a certain, like, they obviously substitute the epic for the love triangle melodrama there.
Yeah, I think that's really what. But in a sense, that's Curtiz's legacy, right?
Yes, for sure.
Like he's really one of the pioneers of these action adventure, not ultra high budget, but enjoyable, like really really high entertainment cinema.
Yeah.
And that's like you look through the 1930s catalog of Michael Curtiz, it's like that. It's like constantly entertaining, adventure films, drama, romance, like all these kind of, they're all, largely, within an hour and 40 minutes.
Yeah.
They're not overly long. And that really changed the shape of Hollywood, I think, the specter of like the Griffithian vision of an epic film really sort of disappeared really over a very long period of time.
Yeah.
I'd say the true end of it was the failure of Heaven's Gate. The real first thing that sort of started its decline, I think, was the Curtiz and others, but like that wave of the 30s of genre films that really appealed to people and could, make a lot of money.
Yeah.
But were produced at relatively lower cost, high charisma, low cost.
Oh, you know what just sprung to my mind was the abundance of, obviously, the epic seemed to have a bit of a revival. Obviously, after World War II, we saw an abundance of these war pictures, which kind of replaced that epic.
Oh, I mean, late Cecil B. DeMille, right?
But there's a biblical epic as well, but the abundance of these noir pictures and sci-fi and horror pictures of the 1950s, the post-war era, which we could argue, well, Curtiz definitely pioneered this in respect of the Dr. X film, which is a mixture. It's like the bridge between those. I think it was aping on the universe, the Frankenstein craze of the time. It's 1932, the year after the James Whale film was released, and these later films of more, with scientific tropes. Like Dr. X is all about a group of scientists trying to use a device to try and figure out which one is the murderer.
Yeah, and I think it was 1931 actually.
Dr. X?
Yeah, I think it's actually parallel to the...
Oh, there you go then.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So it's fascinating to me that, I can see how Curtiz pioneered a kind of a more... an abundant audience-pleasing film that is lower in its scale and didn't require as much just logistical cost and the maneuvering of large amounts of people, props to a location. There's just the legendary, D.W. Griffith's Lost City for Intolerant. Is that true? Is that city, or am I thinking of something else? How like the big set was of the Babylon set ended up, they just kind of abandoned it and left it behind.
Yeah.
I think you've forgotten Silver, that film.
I might be confusing my memory, so I won't comment on
okay,
that. I know that there is a big. I think that might have been from some Cecil B. DeMille.
Oh yeah, right.
I think Cecil B. DeMille is like another example of the kind of figure I was talking about when I was talking about someone who was there from the start too.
Yeah.
And there are some others. One that I feel like might not get talked about so much, but I feel is in a sense another failure in the way that I personally feel that Cecil B. DeMille fails to live up to that standard of that vision that I initially had of like the auteur from the founding of film language, not necessarily the auteur, but the filmmaker from the founding of film language, who would come to, who would bring that sort of knowledge of the fundamentals and unique perspective to later works. Another example of a key one, who almost bizarrely is a kind of the only success at this, the only like true success who meets the definition that I was initially had conceived. But I don't like them that much as a filmmaker. Norman Z. McLeod.
Okay, wow. I know him from... He directed the Marx Brothers film Horse Feathers?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he did what's it called, that incredible W.C. Fields film. I'm blanking on the name right now.
It's a Gift?
It's a Gift. He did It's a Gift.
Wow. Okay.
You know, he was... I think he was kind of... I might be getting it wrong here. I think he was kind of a little bit later to directing than some of the others, which might actually disqualify him. Let me check right now.
No worries.
But his final film is kind of the kind of thing that I was looking for. Okay, he started directing in 1928, so he was not early enough by a long stretch.
Yeah.
But his final film is interestingly like the kind of film that I was talking about, which is alias Jesse James. It's like a Bob Hope like comedy western, but
okay.
And it's terrible,
yeah.
But it's so unusual, like
okay.
in terms of how it's made. There are just moments of sheer chaos where you'd be like, yeah, this is what the director of It's a Gift would be doing in the dawn of new wave film.
That's terrific.
To sort of sum up on it, like I think that's really why I was interested in Curtiz and Vidor and Allan Dwan overall, you know what I mean? Like that's why I came to appreciate them, because they were people who were in that category of, I guess, pioneers who really excelled over a long career, and there was actually something to show for it. You know what I mean? They while they didn't truly live up to like having that incredible late work, I mean, maybe you could. There's possibly an argument for Dwan, because I do like the late era.
I would love to have at least a brief discussion on some of those later Dwan films.
Yeah, well maybe we can dive into it now.
Just before we do that, I really wanted to. I found it so fascinating when you were talking about how, Cecil B. DeMille never really seemed to impress you in the way that you wanted to be impressed by one of these great directors. These days, I think a lot of the film community, cinephile, if you will, community agrees with you. Cecil B. DeMille has been not dismissed, but downplayed. Not even downplayed, just, you can't downplay someone as commercially prominent at one time as Cecil B. DeMille.
Yeah.
I mean, we all know the name. He's one of the first directors you hear of in a respect. I mean, if for no other reason, Sunset Boulevard will always be a beloved film, and there he is in there.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of fascinating to me how he's been kind of what would you say? Just distanced.
Well, I think that is not really that surprising. I mean,
I'm not surprised either. You watch the films.
I mean, yeah, like, I don't know, like it's a bit like how Gone with the Wind is a bit like, people are not looking at Gone with the Wind so fondly these days.
That's a good point.
I think, the values that his films represent are values that, people don't hold as much today. Values that people have recognized were, not a good value system to govern society by. Not values that were, fair, really. So I think on that basis, a lot of his films have been somewhat, have come to be looked down upon more, or not appreciated as much.
Yeah.
And then also, I think the other thing, which, as someone who's seen a lot of film from pre-New Wave era,
Mhm.
it's not exactly a surprise to me when I see a film that has, is racist,
Yeah.
or, has a very far right perspective. Like, when that is not really a surprise if you've seen a lot of film from that era, because you realize that, the track of history, it's only very recently that we had, women's suffrage and stuff like that. It's only very recently that, there was a true, reckoning in society that racism was bad. Like, it's not that surprising that, fairly recently, in the other half of the history of cinema, chronologically,
Yeah.
there were just racism and, disgusting attitudes were abundant.
Mm.
So that's not a surprise to me about Cecil B. DeMille. I mean, the dude was literally like one of the biggest supporters of McCarthyism.
That's true. I forget that.
Yeah. So, what is more sort of surprising to me, and us, in a sense, more disappointing,
Yeah.
is the fact that his aesthetic vision is dusty and dated. Like, he
Yeah.
doesn't have, he has that, he's sort of that school of thought of, like, his theory of, his cinematographic theory was very much about realism over aesthetic, like realism ruling over aesthetic. Like, his films are the realization of a literary view of film in high budget, right? Like, that's what it is. In, like, classical high budget, that's what it is. And I feel like that is something that has been discredited. Like, as an artistic vision, that's been discredited by the passage of time. And I'm not really just talking about, when I'm evoking Cecil B. DeMille, like, I've seen a lot of his later work, and I'm not really just talking about the Ten Commandments, right? I'm talking about, Unconquered.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about, like, all of these later period works
Yeah.
that are sort of large in scope.
Yeah.
And, yeah, to be honest, I don't really find that much there.
Yeah. When I think of Cecil B. DeMille, I think of a director who is more interested in placing content in front of the camera rather than actually doing anything technically completely interesting with the medium itself.
Yeah.
And also, when I think of Cecil B. DeMille, I think of another film like Gone with the Wind and, like, say, the Ten Commandments, that seems to have, was the hugest film in its era, and there was a semi-famous phrase / saying going along with this film. To be, at one time, to say that something was as big as Ben-Hur was apt, but now Ben-Hur is barely considered an acclaimed film in contemporary circles, and certainly the remake of it bombed in 2016, so to no one's surprise.
Yeah.
But it's very easy to see why, because films like Ben-Hur, films like Gone with the Wind, films like the Ten Commandments, they came from a very simplistic, non-nuanced worldview of a black and white world where, I mean, look, I'm not trying to make fun of Christian culture, Judeo-Christian culture, or American culture, but there was a time when it was essentially, our way of life is good and the other is not. And isn't it nice that we can sit here in the United States and watch this film about how our culture was good and this and that? And, in this day and age when the realities of the world are there's not as much wool over our eyes anymore, And a film about so one note, and I guess you could arguably say didactic. Not that there's much intellectualizing going on in these films, but they're so one note and simplistic, and people don't really have time for them anymore. There's more of an appeal for these Douglas Sirk melodramas these days because of what they can tell us about the life and times of the America in the 1950s. But these period piece epics, these grand productions, are essentially dismissed these days. And you know what? It's easy to see why. I'd rather not. I'm the biggest fan of the Douglas Sirk melodramas, but I'd rather watch those and the V. DeMille or Ben-Hur. I've seen Ben-Hur twice. Not really my thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a controversial take, but I feel similarly about William Wyler to how I feel about Cecil B. DeMille. Like, admittedly, he's not as out of step with our current values, but I feel like a lot of his films are aesthetically cloying. I feel like his like the concepts behind films like Miss Miniver and
Roman Holiday.
Yeah, even Roman Holiday, even though that one is somewhat celebrated today.
Yeah, a little bit.
The concepts behind those kinds of films are, to me, representative of the worst of the old Hollywood consensus.
Yeah.
Aside from things that were blatantly immoral.
Yeah.
Right? But yeah, I think maybe then we should.
Oh, Allan Dwan, the last.
Yeah.
Yeah. Two Allan Dwan films that stick out to me in particular from the later era. One especially. I have a certain degree of fondness toward. I am outright fond of 1955's Escape to Burma. This is in some respects, it's essentially a mainstream Hollywood romance. With the Technicolor in this film is absolutely fantastic, and secondly, it really begins to represent, like, I could posit Escape to Burma as a film as to, someone who reads a lot of novels and is fairly dismissive of films would probably look at Escape to Burma and dismiss it. But a film like Escape to Burma is precisely why I would rather watch a film than read a novel, because I would just rather speculate about what's going through these characters' heads, and I'd like the kind of I guess you would say, well, often in a film there's this, especially in current discourse on the behavior of characters in films, there's this notion of, in internet discussions especially, why would she do that? Why did they do that? That doesn't make any sense. But why would she try to help the fugitive on the run? It's like, well, it's almost as though people in characters like real people make illogical decisions based upon impulse.
Yeah.
And I like that. I think it's, how come Robert Ryan didn't, how come he didn't wait till the end of the film to say that he only shot the Maharaja's son because the Maharaja's son had the plague and was going to potentially infect other people. He might not even know why he did. It doesn't really matter. Did we really want a scene where he explained to Barbara Stanwyck, oh yeah, this is what, they'd complain about it even more. It just seems that I find sometimes I like familiarity. It's a kind of comfort. And look, it's a jungle adventure film. If it experimented too much, it would, I don't know if I'd enjoy it as much. That's my brief odd spiel on Escape to Burma.
I think that's really well put. Escape to Burma is also one of my favourite late Dwan films, and I think it's got that fantastic John Alton cinematography. I think this is like right before he shot Tea and Sympathy for Vincent Minnelli. Like, this is really a key period of just like a key wave of like really expressive color photography, and of course it really does emerge from that soup of like B genre films and just like cheap thrills essentially, but it's fantastically put together. Like experientially, it's evoking like a time and place that never really existed. It's like it's sort of that thing why so many of um, those cheap films from that era are compelling despite many of them having obvious flaws.
Yeah.
It's because they're evocative of this like this mysticism, this like time and place, this grand adventure that that never really existed, but we sort of yearn towards somehow. And I think why Escape to Burma is so special is it's one of those films that's sort of more polished, less tainted than a lot of them. It's really, there's not really a department where we can really, well, I mean, there are some if we start thinking in, socio-political terms, but, there isn't really a filmic department where I feel like we can knock this film. It's just making it like one of the exemplars of, I guess I'd be correct in saying a lost aesthetic.
Yeah. I think where it's interesting. Earlier I mentioned how I wasn't as fond of Douglas Sirk films. Where I have a major preference in Escape to Burma over the Douglas Sirk films, and this is something which was rather, you could argue this was a consistent facet of Dwan's, the strong lead performance and the strong female character that in Barbara Stanwyck's, she's referred to as grandma by her subjects. I don't remember what her actual character's name is, but she is essentially she's the assertive presence in the film, and this makes me recall how prominent Allan Dwan's leading ladies were in the early 1920s in films like Zazie. And I haven't seen this film, but Slightly Scarlet is more along this sort of line
as well as the woman they almost lynched. He has quite a few. That's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think versus like some of these other directors that we might see as like titans of the era. I think he is one that leans more towards female protagonists.
I can't think of a huge amount in the filmography of, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael Curtiz, or there's Mary of Scotland by John Ford, but that's the only. Oh, and Seven Women toward the end there.
Yeah.
But that's a significant film. I have to say, in this respect, I have to say.
In terms of
not a huge amount in his character.
In terms of a woman as the lead, I think not many in Curtiz. And
Vidor had a couple with Betty Davis, I believe.
Yeah, I think you could say, even in something like Jewel in the Sun, it's like a shared lead, I guess.
Excuse me.
But I think that is true. That is an aspect of Dwan's filmography. Interesting.
Yeah, it makes me recall. It's as though normally these films have a male seduced by the woman. It's almost in this film. It's the owner of this property, played by Barbara Stanwyck. She's seduced by Robert Ryan's character in an interesting somewhat role reversal manner.
Yeah.
And the other film that I thought that I really wanted to discuss in the context of Allan Dwan's filmography, and it is his last film, a very fascinating picture from 1961, called Most Dangerous Man Alive, a science fiction horror film, which is... The way I would choose to describe this film is very bizarre, and I think most people would find this a strange description. The Most Dangerous Man Alive is the kind of film you would watch. It's like it's the kind of film I feel like I would watch if I was having a dream, and I was watching a film in the dream, and this is the kind of film I would watch.
I definitely can understand that, because it's very archetypal, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's very archetypal to a lot of aspects of B genre films, and it's very successful in doing that. I might actually, I mean, maybe slightly Scarlet, or, you know, there are a few others that I could see maybe taking my favorite, the pole position of my favorite Dwan film, but that one would definitely be up there.
Yeah.
And I think it is just like an incredible film that really has everything that you could ever want for, well, not maybe not ever want, but everything that I wanted from like some trash B sci-fi movie made in 1961. Like, it's so expressionistic with the cinematography.
Yeah.
It's so, you know, it has that very, you know, it's got the noir vibes. It's got, you know, all the elements of it, you know, tie into this very efficient, like, you know, like Curtiz kind of screenplay.
Yeah.
Of like some dude getting, you know, transformed, you know, into a monster, and getting, you know, incredible powers. It's really just incredibly fun to watch through. In every way, it's just a really great film to enjoy.
And what a few qualities about the film that I find interesting is that, as I suggested before, there is a strange dreamlike, ethereal quality to the film in some respects. It reminds me of those kind of stranger auteur melodramas, like The Lady from Shanghai and The Woman on the Beach by Jean Renoir.
Oh, I know what you mean. I think there's like an aliteral, like non-literal quality to the narrative. It's like the dialogue is very I don't know, it feels like solitary and yeah, I definitely see what you mean. It feels like it's taking place in a broader world of, like, you know, in the same world where Lady from Shanghai is taking place, and like
It takes place in film logic world, not in the real world.
Exactly.
I notice how in Most Dangerous Man Alive, it made me think of how, you know how in some of the later, I guess Blue Velvet was and Wild at Heart were the first ones to do it. You know how there's this quality in the David Lynch films where noir tropes are portrayed as fantasy archetypes? I feel like this is very, like, everything is really pronounced and emphasized in Most Dangerous Man Alive, almost as though every action is significant, like it would be in a silent film.
Yeah.
Here's the free enter the room, they've got the guns, you know, now he's entering here, he's going over here, and it's like everything in this plot is significant, especially considering, I think that they had to rush the production of this film in like a few weeks in Mexico, from what I understand, and so I believe, you know, and because the concept of this film is so, you know, it's such a potent concept, and what I mean by that is it's, you know, no one was under any mystery as to what kind of film they were making, and so it's like every element of the production, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there was such a consistency to every facet of this production in realizing the idea, and so, you know, the lighting in each interior is, you know, very obvious. We'll have the lamp or an open window or a mirror situated in the frame. There's I don't know.
No, I see what you're saying. Like, I feel like that's really a reflection of maybe an old auteur at the end of their career, right? Knowing the set like the back of their hand. Yeah, I see what you're saying. There's like a unity to everything in the production, really. just driving towards this like vision, not a new vision. There's a plethora of films like that from the 50s, 40s, even 30s. Somewhere.
Yeah.
This vision of a sci-fi, whatever. Obviously it's inflected heavily by Cold War paranoia. Yeah, I do feel like there's and this is maybe a time to bring up King Vidor, because I feel like that's an apt comparison where this film has sort of like the starkness and the driving clarity of idea that his films have, that usually Allan Dwan films don't, right? Like, I mean, you can point to some of maybe his early westerns and stuff, but that's not typically an element that I'd associate with Dwan.
Yeah. Dwan is interesting. I was thinking about the decade I've seen the least from Allan Dwan is, well, maybe not the least, because I was going to, well, the 1930s is an era I haven't seen a huge amount, if much at all, from Allan Dwan, but I'm not sure if I've seen a huge amount from the 1940s either, that being said. But the 1930s, it seems as though Dwan, after being the kind of a king in the silent era in the 20s, was kind of relegated to, I mean, maybe a lot of famous directors were, this was the Depression, these lower budgeted comedies and romantic films. The one film I've definitely seen from him during this period, and I may not ever get another chance to talk about this film, so why not? But there's a comedy film from 1939. There was this successful play called The Gorilla, wherein a man in a gorilla suit would run around and commit to some antics on the stage. And this, I think, Allan Dwan picture was the third film adaptation in Hollywood of this play. And there was a few, and I think what was unique about this adaptation of the film is it was turned into a Ritz Brothers vehicle. And the Ritz Brothers sound like a second-rate Marx Brothers, because from what I can understand, I think that's what they were.
That's what they were. They were like a third rate.
Oh, so you know that? I didn't even know. Okay.
I've seen The Gorilla as well.
Okay,
it's like
wonderful.
It's. I'll tell you why I watched it, and this isn't really like a proud reason.
Yeah.
It was because I was looking at the Dwan filmography, filtering for the IMDb tag of horror, and only one film came up.
Just that one?
Just that one. So I watched it. It's. I think it's. There was like a weird transition going on in his career at that moment in like 1939. It might predate that a little bit as well though, but like he also, in the same year, he also did like a comedy version of the Three Musketeers.
Okay.
Where like he was trying to look again for relevance, because I think the Depression was over.
Yeah.
He'd been through a period where in the early 1930s, I think was up to that point in his career, like the lowest point of his career, where he was making these really cheap, like 1 hour films. Basically, he was adjacent to all these people doing film serials, basically, at that stage. And it was like a fall from the heights of Hollywood to really, working on the cheap. And a lot of that has got to be the Depression. But it's also got to be, his style of film somewhat falling out of favor. And I think at the time he was making stuff like the Three Musketeers and the Gorilla. Like he was just looking for anything that would work. And the Gorilla is a notoriously like terrible, like bizarre comedy, barely coherent, like piece of filmmaking.
To me, one of the most fascinating things about that film, The Gorilla, is there's a running gag throughout that film, which is kind of still amazingly still amusing. I find it amusing to this day. And okay, so there's a butler in this film that released in 1939, and the butler in this film is portrayed by none other than Bela Lugosi, who's famous for portraying Dracula about nearly 10 years before this. And there's a female character in this film who is constantly wary and terrified of this butler because it's portrayed by Bela Lugosi, and then they angle it in a way where he does appear, when we do cut to him, he does appear intimidating, almost as though we're watching where he's going to be revealed as a vampire later on. This never happens, but it's this strange sort of fourth wall joke, which still seems to translate a little bit today, because we were thinking, wait a minute, that's Bela Lugosi.
I know what you're talking about. That's like one of that's one of the gags that people actually remember from the Gorilla, and I feel you as well. It's sort of like it's sort of one of those things where it's interesting to look back in retrospect, where, like, you know, today Bela Lugosi is not, like, you know, universally recognized in the way.
Not really, yeah.
I mean, you probably have a lot of people who see the Gorilla and they don't understand that guy. You know, that just seems like another bizarre aspect of the film that doesn't make any sense. And it makes me wonder how many other references there are to just, like, things of that era in that film.
Yeah.
That we don't get because they've truly just, like, gone out of the public consciousness.
That would be amazing.
I mean, I can imagine that particularly being things that, like, aren't of the film world, like references to real life things, or like, you know, public figures and stuff.
References to I don't know, the presidencies of Herbert Hoover or FDR, or just things we don't necessarily get as much.
Possibly. I'm not sure. Yeah. It would be interesting to see. But, I mean, suffice to say, not really a proud moment in the career of Allan Dwan.
Perhaps not.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was going to bring up there's this one amusing oddity in the canon of Michael Curtiz. This is one of his later films, and we talked about, you mentioned how after 1954, was it 54? Curtiz had...
54, yeah. I'm not sure what year that he went to the other studio, but when he founded his own studio, I should say. But I'm not... but it was around then, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the films he created during this period was... released in 1959, there's a Western titled The Hangman.
Oh no.
Which is... Now, Michael Curtiz is sometimes credited with helping to kickstart that Western boom. In 1939, Dodge City was released, the same year as Stagecoach. Now, more people would say Stagecoach. But Dodge City I have seen cited quite a lot as well.
Yeah.
I'm much more of a Stagecoach fan, but Dodge City is perfectly okay as well. And then you have a film like The Hangman, which honestly comes across as a damning indictment of the American Western from someone who was born in Europe. It might not be that, unfortunately. I don't think that really crossed anyone's mind. But I mean, The Hangman's just one of these films where it really makes your jaw drop at what... I mean, it's like... a contemporary satire show might, let's say you have The Simpsons, and The Simpsons might show a film from the 1950s to make fun of what 50s values were like, where literally there's two major male protagonists, a kind of a jerk off and this kind of more nice fellow, and the kind of sunshine and roses female lead of this film ends up kind of going with the jerk at the end, even though the jerk's saying, like, oh yeah, you know, you should go with the good guy, and she's like, I want you instead, and he's just sort of like, well, you heard it, kid. And it makes me think of those big Crosby and Bob Hope films end, and, and also
that's true,
the Road to films that I used to watch on TVS way back when, and for some reason.
I think at this stage I've seen all the Curtiz westerns, and that one was the worst. Like, that one is really shocking for having almost no redeeming attributes. It's not a particularly charismatic film. It's Alan Ladd, isn't it?
As a star?
Yeah, who stars?
I believe so.
Yeah.
This is around the time of... He also had Alan Lad in Man in the Net around this time.
Yeah.
Which is a superior film.
Yeah.
It's a kind of noir thing.
I think I haven't seen that one yet.
Okay.
But I'm keen to see that one.
I'd recommend that, yeah.
Not much to say about it. It's cinematographically barren.
Yeah.
It's like a morality play that like comes out with the wrong moral conclusion.
Yeah.
it's really mired in some of the like less interesting, small town aesthetics that people aspired to in that day. So it's really one of the worst Curtiz films I've seen. I mean, some of the other stuff I've seen from that era is also pretty, I don't like have that much positive to say about it. Like, there was this film, what was it called? It was set in France. I better look it up. And it was about this, I think he was like the son of a king, and he's going to revolution. I'm barely remembering it, but it's very very much trying to ape the style of the John Huston Moulin Rouge film. The Vagabond King.
Okay.
There we go. I didn't need to look that up, but it's it's such a flaccid film, really. Like there's nothing interesting going on. The sets are just so obvious and bland and banal. Like it really is just completely disposable. And I like thinking about most of these films from that era. Unfortunately, I feel like that's really the case.
I know you're a fan of some of the ones from the early 50s. Like you've championed The Egyptian and also the Kirk Douglas film Man with a Horn.
Oh yeah, those are fantastic. I think The Egyptian is really, that's really one where I feel like I love the look of that film.
Yeah.
Egyptology, that Egyptology boom or whatever you want to call it, like that, all the films made in that mold, it's really about, they're absolutely absurd and ludicrous conceptually. All of them.
Yeah.
All of them. They're totally silly. We don't want to, overstate their narrative virtues. But people look to them as, an interesting offshoot of the epic film. And in my personal opinion, it's one of the two that has the most interesting aesthetic design, along with the Howard Hawks film, I think, which is Land of the Pharaohs. Land of the Pharaohs isn't.
Okay.
Yeah, which was obviously produced for a much larger budget, but I think. One of the interesting things about The Egyptian is that it has this, that famous commentary on Transformers, that part of the design and appeal of that film and that film franchise, now talking about Michael Bay, was around this blue and orange kind of visual design that was supposed to, speak to the lizard brain within all of us. Interestingly, I feel like The Egyptian has like a more manicured version of that.
Wow.
You should watch it. It's there's very much like a depth and dynamicism and interesting quality to that aesthetic design, which I really like. I feel like Man with a Horn is just basically, it's a jazz film. It's Champion, but with a saxophonist instead of a boxer, and Kirk Douglas is great.
Yeah. Did Michael Curtiz also direct that that Burt Lancaster film, Jim Thorpe, All American, or am I mistaken?
Yeah, he did.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't seen that one.
I haven't seen that yet, but yeah.
It's around that time, I think.
Yeah, I think that's like 52.
Mm.
Let me think. What other films would I highlight from like late Curtiz? Maybe. I mean, there's The Breaking Point, of course, which is. I mean, I guess that's probably, apart from White Christmas, that would be considered like his last classic.
Yeah.
I mean, I think something to say now about Curtiz maybe is an observation that I've made before, which is that if you cut out all of these like other films like The Egyptian and you know there are dozens of them. Another one from the 50s is Sweet Leaf, about tobacco farmers, which has this incredible like immaculate black and white cinematography. Like passionate drama, hint of Southern Gothic. Like, it's incredible, right? There are just dozens of these films throughout the Curtiz filmography that are just like forgotten classics, essentially. If you were to cut out all these films and just have the set of films he was most known for, I mean, people would revere him like a Kubrick figure, right? Like, think about if we had a film director who, like, let's say, first film was, let's say, The Undesirable. Even though that's not particularly one that I'm super keen on.
Mm-hmm.
You had that, Young Medardus, say Noah's Ark, then Dr. X, Mysteries of the Wax Museum, Captain Blood.
Mm-hmm.
Dodge City, Casablanca. If we had that like progression of films, like that was the entire Curtiz filmography, and there wasn't anything else. Just like going through these classics, like and so on, Breaking Point, Mildred Pierce, all these films that he's celebrated for, sort of ending on White Christmas. People would say, this guy's a genius. This guy's better than Howard Hawks. This guy's the greatest director of old Hollywood. I think a lot of people would think that. I think he'd be revered as this like Kubrick type figure who worked in a lot of different genres, but every genre he came to he made like a significant picture in.
Right.
And then, I can imagine in that world where he's only made, 20 or so films, people will be like, if only he'd been able to make more films. We live in the world where he made more films. We live in the world where he made 150 or whatever number he made films. But somehow he's not valued for that.
No.
And I think that speaks to this weird thing that people have where they value, there's sort of this, it confounds me that this cultural perception that, people prefer a filmmaker like Tarkovsky or someone like that who has like a filmography of like, a very small filmography where every film is well regarded. Whereas I'm much more interested in someone with a large body of work. That's more impressive to me. Someone who could make 3 films in a year, and one of them is a masterpiece, and one of them is, an underrated classic, and the third one might be a dud. But like that to me is more impressive than someone who made, one film every 5 years and it's well regarded.
Oh yeah, those are the exact thoughts I had when I revisited and did a brief write-up this year of Sakharov's Days of Eclipse. I remember making snarky remarks in my little semi-review of Sakharov should have made less films because then people would like him more.
That's certainly true of Sakharov, yeah. I can imagine if he'd made 5 films, people would be like, this guy's, they'd see him as Tarkovsky.
Oh yeah. So that's what making all those films. That's you're prolific filmography gets you Sakharov. People respect you. I mean, I love you. I think you're the man. But
I think you'll find that all of my favorite directors, which I count Sakharov among, the very top echelon, right?
Yeah.
All my favorite directors are very prolific. You know, have done a lot of work because I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think that's a virtue rather than something they should be penalized for.
I generally agree. I mean, who I just want to bring this individual up. Someone who did make all of those did make an extensive amount of films, and is still acclaimed today. They're a bit more controversial though. We've mentioned them a few times in the discussion, and I guess they're more arguable an auteur, and that's the John Ford. Like, John Ford sits in a strange place. Now, John Ford, it's easy to argue, is an auteur. It's you could argue he's, like, let's say his 5 most well-known films are more well-known than the 5 most well-known Michael Curtiz films. Actually, probably inarguably. Let's say you
think
search
so? Well, yeah, I guess so.
So, I mean, Casablanca is probably more famous than any of
Casablanca
Curtiz, Ford's films.
Yeah, definitely.
But between The Searchers and Stagecoach, Man Who Shot Liberty Valance...
Oh, yeah.
And,
I mean, Robin Hood is probably...
Yeah, Robin Hood exists.
Can probably compete with, like, I don't know what's going to be the 5th. Robin Hood would beat the 5th John Ford film, whether that's My Darling Clementine.
That's it.
Like, I think it's sort of in the same territory overall. Like, if we had a top 5 of each, like, Mildred Pierce is pretty fucking famous.
The Quiet Man from John Ford, probably.
Oh yeah, Quiet Man.
Very famous.
Mildred Pierce is pretty famous, particularly since they made a mini-series remake of it.
With Todd Haynes helming
Yeah,
that,
I think Todd Haynes did it.
Yeah, good on him.
Yeah. So, I don't know, I guess you'd probably say that, John Ford's 5 most famous are more famous than Curtiz's 5 most famous, but I guess that also is one of these things where
John Ford's most well known for Western, so he's known as the Western. I mean, The Quiet Man is an exception. Where it's really The Quiet Man isn't really an exception if you look at the grand scheme of John Ford.
It's not. It's an exception in the degree of acclaim that it received.
Yeah. I think. I guess people perceive that as well as it's a John Wayne film and he wasn't playing a cowboy, which it was.
I mean, there are really a lot of John Wayne. The majority of John Wayne films, he's not playing a cowboy. You know what I mean?
I guess, yeah.
It's just endless films. Like, have you seen Big Jim McLean?
Was he playing a detective in that?
He's playing an employee of the U.S. government. Like, I think his CIA agent who goes to Hawaii to bust up communist rings.
Oh shit!
It's one of the. Like, you should just watch it. It's just an absolute fucking ball. I can't remember who directed it. It was some...
Wasn't Andrew McDougall, was it?
Might have...
He's a bit later.
It was like 1952.
Yeah, it's too early.
I can't remember who made it, but it's just like... It was some, minor director. Anyway, what were we saying?
John Ford.
Oh, John Ford, yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say he is an auteur. Like, just the degree of
He's so technical as well.
He was so technical, and there is really a pattern to how he shoots and frames scenes. And I think there is definitely a degree to which he shaped all the genre films that sort of, periphorated around him.
And also, it's been written how every now and again I'll read about one of these John Ford films, and it'll mention in a writing on the film that John Ford looked at the script, made significant changes to the script, and then they went to go shoot The Fugitive from 1947. Is very prominent in this respect, and that's almost as expressionistic as a John Ford film has ever been. And I believe in a lot of the later works in the 50s, he was very careful about how the narrative went in films like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, probably Seven Women as well. He was very considerate of the kind of story he was telling.
Yeah, he was much more of a writer director as well as I mean, admittedly, he didn't have writing contributions to all of his films, but in terms of like his aura as an auteur, like. through, the parallel strands of making contributions to a screenplay, or at least changes, and the way in which he would shape narratives on screen. I mean, I think it's really safe to say that he was really an obvious example of an auteur in the classical sense of like someone who had like narrative visions and themes and maybe some filmmaking, tricks that they would repeat over and over again, in a way that, certainly Curtiz was not.
You take a film from 1935 like The Informer, it's so chock full of film language and uniquely utilizing the medium to more effectively communicate what's going on in the heads of its players.
Yeah,
it's a smart film.
I really want to see like the whole of like 30s forward, because like a lot of the films from that era, like that, like Stagecoach as well, or like The Hurricane,
Prisoner of Shark Island.
Yeah, Prisoner of Shark Island,
Great
perfect example. Even something like The Young Mr. Lincoln, like there are just like a whole set of films from that era which are like just so full of like visual ideas that it's just I really want to see the whole set.
I even love the use of, there's a lot of great utilization of light and dark in Mary of Scotland.
Yeah.
Just powerfully acted film.
Another one is I'm forgetting the name. I saw it last year for the first time, and it blew me away how good it was. It's a prison drama, and I think it's like one of the first films that Humphrey Bogart ever repeated. Up the River. I think it's like 1930.
Yeah.
Just like another film of like, just like not necessarily filled with visual ideas, but like just so immaculate in how it's made, just like compelling drama that just, I think, lost by the wayside because people can't engage with it in really basic narrative terms because of short attention span or what. I don't know, like it just seems so tragic. I mean, maybe this is a conversation for another day, but this is why I don't feel like being bored during a film is a relevant critique of the film. Like I feel like not being able to hold your attention to a film is your failing, not the film's failing.
Yeah, like I'll here's where I'll stand on that. There are going to be films which don't interest me, and that's kind of just on me. It's just not what I enjoy. It's like if I don't find a film very interesting, look, it's like me saying a documentary whose subject I don't find interesting is a bad documentary. It's almost irrelevant. Like I'll like there's an enormous amount of films I am interested in watching, especially because by virtue of a film being an historical object after say 20-25 years, it intrinsically becomes more interesting to me anyway, and I'm just looking at it as a piece of history. But I do basically agree where you're coming from, because I'm someone, and I don't know you're someone, and pretty much everyone is, but like we don't really care about a film's storyline. What we do care about is how it's told, and frankly that's everyone. Whether they realize it or not, they're not really interested in a film's story so much as how it's told. They might disagree. We might disagree on how we like a story to be told. Someone might like their action sequences told for that Paul Greengrass sort of way, whereas we might not like that so much. It's just a matter of opinion.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do see where you're coming from, and I'll be the first to admit that I would really, really, really rather not use the adjective boring when I can think of several others that are more suited to it. Like, I mean, look, a film can be dull, but that's because it is attempting something legitimate and failing due to a lack of enthusiasm or care or consideration.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like a film can be sort of devoid of ideas or concept or moments or things of interest, and that's something you can say about it. But like being bored on an individual basis, like each film you should view as, the viewing experience is not like something that you should really do passively and just like let it wash over you and whatever soaks into your brain is what you regurgitate into your thoughts on the film. You should really look at a film with an eye towards really evaluating it, I think. And if that is your view, then I really think being bored is not a valid critique.
It's interesting. I guess it's... I'm in a weird place because I don't necessarily expect a film to... Like, watching a film for me is more of a... I hope this doesn't sound pretentious, but I'm just trying to describe what's going on inside me physiologically, but it's more of a head sensation than a heart and soul sensation. Like, I'm not watching a film to feel good. I'm watching a film because it's essentially just an act of analysis. I'm not in depth, and I'm not going to be watch a film and it's going to be the final word on that film for myself or for anyone else. But it's just a matter of I find it to be good mental stimulation rather than a kind of uplifting experience, which I imagine is why most people consume films. Like, it's very different than, like, when I consume music, it's more of... I mean, there is an element of, especially if it's a music I'm really familiar with, and it's like, oh, let's go over all the Pink Floyd albums again and, like, just really consider what's going on here. Like, there are things like that, King Crimson, Camel, whatever, but yeah, with films, it's so much more of a... Maybe it's because I've directed my own films partially. Now, that does sound pretentious. You're looking at it and you're going and you're just kind of just evaluating what's happening in front of you and the decisions being made. It's like watching... It's like reading someone's essay in a respect.
Well,
just seeing what...
Yeah,
what
I mean, my thoughts on this is, like, when you're a child, you have... Like... You have a certain skill that you lose when you grow older, and this is on like a sliding scale between a skill that you have when you're a young child, an incredible skill, and a skill that you can get as you familiarize yourself with the medium, and the skill that you have when you're a kid is that you really perceive things as a whole, as like a full aesthetic. You know what I mean? Like, if you think back to memories of childhood, like, particularly of music or film or a book, like, things that stuck with you, they have an aesthetic memory, which is really something that you can't get from something that you engage with for the first time today.
It's not easy.
Well, I don't think you really can. They have their own, like, mental texture. You don't get that as an adult. Or at least I don't. Like, I don't form new mental textures anymore. They were already predetermined when I'm a kid.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to be said for when there was so little to associate mentally with the first time you were seeing, like when I'm very young, seeing images in The Jungle Book or Toy Story 1 or the first Star Wars film or The Wizard of Oz, which, like, the moment where the dog pulls out the curtains and then there's the wizard, he's just a human in The Wizard of Oz. Very little like that kind of impactful moment, even like something simple as that, even as an adult. I see what you mean.
I think it's not necessarily a quality of those films either. I
think is I agree. Well, a bit of both.
I think your mental... Well, I mean, I'm not trying to say those films are bad. I'm just saying that that's not a unique quality of those films so much as they are, quality films that have that status that they are sharing to children, right?
Mm.
I think what it is that, you know, I'm not a psychologist, but I think, you know, you are forming the mental reference points in your head to understand the world. You are gaining a visual vocabulary with which to interpret the world as a young child still. And I think those kind of film experiences, or any media experiences really, that cut through, the reason why they create these mental textures is it's not that mental texture isn't the work implanted in your memory. That's the experience that you had seeing it. That's like divorced from the work itself. You could, you know, I've gone back to some of these things and that have had those impressions on me without really evoking that same feeling, even though that still exists within me.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily a quality of the work. It's a quality of my experience as a child engaging with it. And, you know, as you get older, you sort of lose that as you sort of lose, I guess, mental plasticity, and that sort of disappears to me. I feel like the last time that I experienced something like that, possibly last year, but like by that point was like few and far between. You and me are now at the age where our brain doesn't develop anymore. That's over. That just ended in the previous year. And I feel like that ability of generating these mental textures is really relegated almost entirely to like the age of like, I don't know, early childhood, maybe up to the age of like 10, 11, 12, something like that. Then as you get older, you begin to, I don't know, still engaging with these works, let's say film, because that's what we're talking about.
Yes.
You still engage with these films as like a whole as a kid. You adopt the preconceptions about how you should view film from the broader world, and you just, you know, still engage with this as a whole, but through, you know, seeing more, hearing critique, through schooling as well, you gradually get the tools to see, well, this is what they're doing when this sort of narrative is employed. Like, this is the purpose of this is the purpose of that. And you gradually get to the point where, you know, the work becomes more and more disassembled. And, you know, you and me today, as people who've really watched a lot of films, when we watch any film for the first time, you can put on anything right now.
Yeah.
And we would disassemble it in that way because that's the only way we see these things now. You know what I mean? That's how we engage with them. We, not to say we don't see the whole film, but we can't engage with it in the way that a child sees that complete product and really feels it as an aesthetic texture of its own. Because we can see where the ideas come from. We can see why certain things are being employed. We can see, you know, like what the aesthetic design is as opposed to the, you know, conceptual framework. And that's all just sort of stuff that how we'll perceive anything now.
It's like the difference. Like if we went on the YouTube channel Gringo and watched a random Western, we'd be like, okay, yep, late 60s, set in this era of the West, post-Civil War, okay, poorly dubbed, right, yeah. And then whereas theoretically, I mean, obviously a child born around the time we were may not be as engaged with a Western from the 1960s, say, but like, let's say imagine you were in the 1960s watching one of these Westerns on television, and the parents are watching and, you know, kind of passively, oh yeah, it's another story, you know, just like we've been watching last 30 years of our life, and the child's going, wow, gunfight, wow, bar brawl, wow, this carriage is out of control, and there's such a, it's so formative, and it's setting precedents which are long established in the adult audience.
Yep. That's it.
It's very fascinating.